Well, I had the pleasure of interviewing on Friday. This interview will conclude the program. This interview is with Senator Ted Cruz. Thank you very much for participating today. Thank you for joining the program. And I want to begin by asking you.
It's great to be with you.
I want to begin by asking you, what are the guiding principles of President Cruz's Middle East policy, and where does Israel fit in?
Well, thank you, Bret. And let me just say at the outset, I want to welcome everyone at CUFI. I have been there many years in a row. There's so many dear friends at CUFI, including, of course, my dear friends, John and Diane Hagee, who do an incredible job leading this magnificent organization. I was really proud a few months ago to have the chance to go down to San Antonio and celebrate Pastor John's 75th birthday with him, and I'm so grateful for the leadership each of you provides. The question you asked, Bret, is a very important one, and it's particularly important in the light of what's happened the last 6.5 years. Under President Obama, we have seen a consistent pattern of the Obama-Clinton foreign policy that has been alienating and abandoning our friends and allies, and demonstrating weakness and appeasement to our enemies. And there's been no nation for whom that has been more acutely true than the nation of Israel. It has been heartbreaking, and I know the men and women gathered there today are mourning that after the last 6.5 years, we have seen an administration manifest an antagonism to the nation of Israel that is simply unprecedented. In fact, if you and I had sat down 6.5 years ago and done an interview, and I would have suggested to you then, Bret, that Prime Minister Netanyahu would come to the United States, he would address a joint session of Congress, and the President of the United States would boycott the Prime Minister. The Vice President of the United States would boycott the Prime Minister. Every member of the Cabinet would boycott the Prime Minister. In fact, the President would refuse even to speak to the Prime Minister while he was visiting to address a joint session of Congress. You wouldn't have believed that. That would have been an unthinkable action, but yet is exactly what we've seen. Now let's fast forward to January 2017. A new president in the Oval Office is going to face a world much, much more dangerous than was the world 6.5 years ago. A new president is going to face a nation of Israel that we have been abandoning and is in greater peril than it has been in a long, long time. And the new president is going to face radical Islamic terrorism on the rise, and in all likelihood, a new president is going to face the nation of Iran on the verge of having nuclear weapons. In my view, the United States should stand unshakably and unapologetically alongside the nation of Israel.
Senator, let's drill down a little bit into the issues. 22 years ago, we had the beginning of the so-called Oslo peace process. It was supposed to create two states, a Jewish Israeli state and a Palestinian state. Obviously, we're nowhere near that goal. Do you think the United States should continue to support a two-state solution? And if so, how? And if not, what's the alternative?
I don't think it is the role of the United States or any other foreign nation to try to impose a specific solution on the dispute between Israel and the Palestinians. Israel is a sovereign nation. Whether the ultimate solution that is arrived upon by those parties is a two-state solution or a one-state solution or something else, that is a decision for Israel to make. I think a couple of things are important. Number one, it's important that the next president understands Israel is not the impediment to peace. Israel has tried over and over and over again. You know very well from your time at the Jerusalem Post that repeatedly Israel has endeavored to negotiate peace, but the Palestinians have been unwilling to accept peace. And indeed, as long as the PLO refuses to acknowledge Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, as long as the PLO refuses to renounce terrorism. Look, right now the Palestinians are in, as you know, a unity government with Hamas, an avowed terrorist organization. It was about a year ago we saw 3 Israeli teenagers kidnapped and murdered by Hamas. Hamas openly celebrated murdering teenagers, and yet they are part of this unity government. One cannot negotiate peace when the opposing party's objective is seeking to murder you. And so it's important for the next president to understand that. Sadly, President Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry seem to have no understanding whatsoever that the impediment to peace is not Israel, which seeks peace. It is rather Palestinian terrorists who refuse to lay down their arms. Now, if and when peace is achieved, listen, I think the United States should do what it can to facilitate those talks, should do what it can to provide a forum where the sides can have conversations. But I think there has been an arrogance in American policy towards Israel, where you have politicians in the United States dictating, here's how you need to resolve these issues. I remember a couple of years ago, President Obama standing up and demanding a return to the 67 lines. I don't think that is the role of the President of the United States. Israel is a sovereign nation, and her elected leaders can make the determinations that are necessary for the safety and security of Israel.
Senator, a couple of years ago, there was a big debate in the United States dividing both not only Republicans from Democrats, but conservatives from other conservatives, about how to respond to the crisis in Syria and the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons.
Yep.
And you were opposed to the president's use of military force to punish Assad for his use of chemical weapons. Looking at it 2 years now, do you think that on balance that was the right call, seeing that Syria has become now a base for ISIS, a source of 4 million refugees throughout the region, and also the damage to American credibility when an American president sets a red line and then doesn't enforce it?
Right. Well, look, starting at the end of your question, there's no doubt it was a mistake for President Obama to draw that red line and then not honor it. He shouldn't have drawn it in the first place. You know, my view, when 2 years ago, when President Obama proposed a unilateral military attack against Syria, I kept an open mind. My view is U.S. foreign policy should always begin with the vital touchstone of U.S. national security interests. Does it protect the safety and security of this great nation? With respect to Syria, I spent quite a bit of time listening to the administration, listening to the Defense Department, listening to the Pentagon, listening to the White House, and pressing them on how the military attack they were proposing would benefit our national security. And their proposal, it oscillated between two positions, neither one of which made sense. At one point, John Kerry described what the president was proposing as a, quote, unbelievably small attack. Those were his own words, and they were almost self-satirizing, where it became, well, then what exactly is the point beyond sending a disapproving press release, which I don't think is the job of the men and women of our military. The flip side, however, that I press the administration over and over again is, okay, let's suppose the attack is successful. Let's suppose Assad is toppled. Listen, there's no doubt Bashar Assad is a monster. This is a man who's used chemical weapons, who's murdered hundreds of thousands of his own citizens, women and children. But, you know, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend. And the question that I asked the administration over and over again, they wanted then to arm the rebels. There were 9 major Syrian rebel groups there. Of them, at least 7 had major ties to radical Islamic terrorism. And so I asked, all right, how do you distinguish good guys from bad guys? You know, among those 7 was a group that very few people had heard of back then called ISIS. And the administration was proposing supporting groups that were fighting alongside ISIS. And so I asked, well, listen, if you succeed in toppling Assad and the chemical weapons fall into the hands of radical Islamic terrorists, if they fall into the hands of Al-Qaeda or ISIS or al-Nusra, that is worse from U.S. national security perspective, because in that instance, the odds are much, much higher those terrorists would use the chemical weapons either against Americans or against Israelis. And so the reason I opposed it is that there was nothing in the president's plan that was directed to U.S. national security interest. Rather, whenever the president or John Kerry explained what they wanted to do, they would put it in terms of international law norms. And it's not the job of the president to be a law professor in the faculty lounge defending international law. It's the job of the commander-in-chief to protect this country, and allowing dangerous weapons to fall into the hands of radical Islamic terrorists would not do that. That's why I opposed a military attack, because I think it would have undermined our national security interests.
Do we need many more boots on the ground and a much more aggressive military effort to defeat ISIS today in Iraq and Syria?
Absolutely, and the problem starts on the front end with the commander-in-chief who hasn't set a clear objective of destroying ISIS. The commander-in-chief should set out an objective, and you asked in a Cruz administration what the objective would be. If we were facing the same scenario we are now, I would lay out as commander-in-chief, if I'm elected, we will destroy ISIS. We won't degrade them, we won't weaken them, we will destroy them, we will take them out. Right now, ISIS is growing because radical Islamic terrorism feeds on perceived success. And we need to make it that if anyone joins ISIS, they are signing their death certificate. Now, how does one do that? Once the commander-in-chief sets the objective, sets what the goal is, then I think you have to rely on expert military judgment in terms of how to accomplish that goal. You know, last year, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, and Secretary Hagel were both testifying in the Senate Armed Services Committee. And I asked them, I said, if the objective were to destroy ISIS in 90 days, not to weaken or degrade them, but to destroy them, what would be required militarily to do that? General Dempsey responded, he said, I'm sorry, that's simply not possible. I said, okay, General, maybe that time frame is not realistic. You tell me in your expert military judgment what time frame is feasible and what's required to destroy ISIS. And I'm sorry to say General Dempsey's response, he said, there is no military solution to this problem. The only solution is to change the underlying conditions on the ground, to change the poverty so that young men are no longer attracted to radicalism. Now, as I said afterwards, with all respect, that is utter nonsense. The answer to ISIS is not expanded Medicaid in Iraq. And the problem with this administration, among many, but one key problem, you cannot defeat radical Islamic terrorism when you have a president who's unwilling to utter the words radical Islamic terrorism. What do we need to defeat ISIS? Set out the objective, and what should we be doing? You know, based on the military advice that I've received, meeting with a number of generals and admirals and getting their collective advice, I think we need, number one, overwhelming air power. Right now, our rules of engagement are so constrained that in many ways it's photo op foreign policy. It's a bomb here, it's a missile there. It makes for good CNN, but it's not actually working to defeat ISIS. We need to use overwhelming air power.
Senator,
Number two,
let me interrupt you because I just.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I have a sense of what you're going to lay out, but I want to move to different topics in the time that we have. You and I are having this conversation.
Well, let me just quickly let me quickly say the second piece of it, which is that number two, we should be vigorously arming the Kurds. The Kurds are fighting ISIS now. They are friends of ours. They are winning. ISIS is using stolen American military equipment, and the Obama administration keeps refusing to arm the Kurds. I think the Kurds are, in a very real sense, boots on the ground, tens of thousands of effective fighters that are fighting ISIS right now, and for that matter, they're willing to stand up to Iran as well. That should be our principal strategy, and if it requires more embedded special forces to direct the air power, that should be driven by the military necessities, not by politicians in Washington.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Iran, because you and I are speaking on Friday morning, so we don't know whether by Monday there will be some kind of deal. Is there any kind of deal that you think could work, or is any sort of negotiation with this regime in Tehran basically pointless?
Well, yeah, and you and I have talked about this at great length before. I think this Iranian negotiation has gone from bad to worse to catastrophic. And indeed, I think the single greatest national security threat facing the United States today is the threat of Iran acquiring nuclear weapons. I think it's also the single greatest threat to Israel. You know, it's interesting. In past years, a discussion of Israel would typically focus predominantly on the conflicts with the Palestinians. Today, right now, there is no issue that is more dominant, that is more of, as Prime Minister Netanyahu puts it, an existential threat to Israel than a nuclear Iran. And I believe this negotiation poses a tremendous threat both to Israel and the United States. You know, today, Friday, in Iran is Al-Quds Day. It is when they celebrate their goal of the annihilation of Israel. So literally, as American diplomats are going to be in Vienna today, presumably popping champagne and celebrating their political objectives, Iranians are going to be in the streets of Tehran burning Israeli flags and burning American flags. And this deal, at this point, has become an R&D program for the Iranian nuclear program. Right now, under the terms we know, the Obama administration has essentially already given up the entire store. And the problem, Bret, is they're pursuing it as a partisan political objective. Ben Rhodes, the Deputy National Security Advisor, said an Iranian nuclear deal will be the Obamacare of the second term. I think he meant that as a compliment. Unfortunately, the president's approach from day one to Iran has been he wants a domestic political legacy, and the terms of the deal don't really seem to matter. At this point, from what we know of the deal, they're perfectly fine with Iran keeping tens of thousands of centrifuges, keeping mass stockpiles of enriched uranium and continuing to enrich uranium, continuing their ICBM program. And it's worth underscoring the entire purpose of that ICBM program is to carry a nuclear weapon to the United States of America. You don't need an ICBM to get to Israel. That program is very directly aimed at us. And Iran will continue to be,
Let me ask you, so these arguments are laid out, and the administration retorts the alternative to a deal is war. And you Republicans are all warmongers. How do you reply?
You know, the reason the administration says that is because the truth of the matter is President Obama and John Kerry and Hillary Clinton are all perfectly fine with Iran having a nuclear weapon. The inevitable outcome of this deal is one of two things will happen. Either Iran will acquire nuclear weapons, or there will be military conflict. This foolhardy deal makes military conflict more likely, and this is what the administration doesn't understand. They believe in appeasement. I mean, it's almost like they really ought to be conducting these negotiations in Munich and come back and promise a peace for our time. Appeasement doesn't work. I believe in peace through strength. What should we be doing? You know, in my time in the Senate, I have endeavored to be the leading defender of the nation of Israel. We've been able to pass legislation one after the other, strengthening Israel. On Iran, I've introduced my own legislation that actually is a sensible way to approach this. The legislation I've introduced would immediately reimpose sanctions, would strengthen them to make them even more crippling. Iran was starting to reel under the impact of the sanctions until the Obama administration threw them a lifeline. And then the legislation I introduced laid out 4 specific criteria for lifting the sanctions. Number 1, that Iran disassembles all 19,000 centrifuges. Number 2, that Iran would hand over all of its enriched uranium. Number 3, that it would shut down its ICBM program. And number 4, that it would cease being the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. You know, Bret, one of the most stunning things about this deal is that it would allow billions of dollars. One component we understand is a $50 billion signing bonus of frozen assets that would flow into Iran. That money, we know to an absolute certainty, would be used to fund Hezbollah, Hamas, and radical Islamic terrorists throughout the Middle East, throughout Latin America and the world. That money would be used to murder Americans, Europeans, Israelis. This deal, if it's consummated, will transform the United States government into being one of the leading financiers funding terrorism against Americans. It makes no sense whatsoever. And we're going to have over the next couple of months a serious debate over this Iranian deal. It is my hope the American people rise up. In fact, I would give a call of action to the men and women of CUFI. It is critical that each and every one of us reach out, highlight the threat. You know, when Prime Minister Netanyahu describes this as an existential threat, he's not referring to a Frenchman in all black and a beret chain smoking. He means it literally could go to the existence of Israel, because Iran with a nuclear weapon could well use that nuclear weapon over the skies of Tel Aviv or New York or Los Angeles. In the next couple of months, each of us need to reach out to our elected officials and put as much pressure as possible on the people. And here's the real problem. The question is going to be Democrats in the Senate, Democrats in the House. Is their partisan loyalty so great that they're willing to rubber stamp a horrible deal that endangers Israel and endangers our national security? That's what the Obama White House is counting on, that they will be loyal Democrats and sign off on the deal regardless of their obligations to their constituencies. I think it really, CUFI is going to be front and center in the next 60 days, making sure everyone understands the magnitude of the threat this foolhardy deal poses.
Senator, thank you very much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you again, and all the best of luck.
Well, thank you, and God bless each of you. I look forward to seeing each of you very soon.
Okay, thanks a lot.